story starts in the rubble of a defeated nation. Wanted the emperor's powers formally reduced in a new constitution. When he told the Japanese government to do this, they resisted. So, in great secrecy, the Americans wrote it for them.
MacArthur told General Whitney to make the government section write the Constitution. General Whitney called us in, and he said to us, you are now a constitutional assembly. And of course we were all stunned, and that we now would have to write it, and we only had this very short period in which to write it.
We relied on drafts of constitutions that had been prepared by various political parties, as well as constitutions of other countries in the world.
Under Cady's leadership, the American Working Party produced their version in 6 days, and it was revolutionary. Most controversial was Article 9, in which Japan was to renounce war as a sovereign right. And it declared that land, sea and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. At a stormy meeting, the secret American draft was shown to Foreign Minister Yoshida and other Japanese ministers.
He came back to the meeting on the 26th of October, and he was very worried. We could see in his face how worried he was. And he said, well, General MacArthur wants to put the renunciation of war as an article in the Constitution.
They were completely astounded. They had never expected anything as radical as was presented to them.
I think it's only natural for the United States try to discredit the Imperial Japanese Army or Imperial Japanese Navy. But I think the United States, it went rather too far.
Japan passes another democratic milestone as Emperor Hirohito faces the Diet to proclaim Japan's new constitution.
Sovereignty was now vested in the people, not the emperor. The Japanese were told to hold their first post-war election. With universal suffrage and the voting age lowered, there was a heady atmosphere.
Parties grew up like young bamboo shoots after the rain. There was even a charcoal burner who formed a party called the Great Japan Charcoal Production Party.
Mrs. Kato stood as a socialist candidate.
When I got into the hall, I looked around and there was nothing but men. I said, are there any women in this factory? And they said, yes. I said, well, why aren't they here? They said, women don't come inside. I said, what do you mean they don't come inside? Where are they? And they were all standing outside, pressed up against the windows, and obviously wanting to come in.
Japan's women make history as the country comes through the first free election ever known in the land of the geisha girls and not-so-honorable warlords.
あの娘が生まれて、まだ、1歳ちょっと誕生ぐらいの時におんぶして。
When I went to vote, I took my daughter. I carried her on my back, and I thought, we Japanese women have struggled for such a long time for this one vote. Women will surely be happier in my daughter's generation.
権利がなくていつでも泣いて暮らしてたこの娘の時代には本当に女は幸福になれる。
The socialists were most enthusiastic about reform, but they lacked political experience. It was the conservatives who won most seats when the results came in. Shigeru Yoshida now became prime minister. He had to obey the Americans, but he was convinced that a strong Japan could re-emerge once the occupation was over. His daughter worked with him.
We used to walk at night over these barren land, and he used to keep telling himself, we will stand up again, we will stand up again. I know this nation will stand up again.
新生日本の建設の基盤たるべき憲法改正案が匿名によって審議されましたのであります。 幸いにして今議会は新選挙法による総選挙の結果成立したる歴史的民主議会であります。
From the start of the new democratic parliament, there were sharp disagreements between the right and the newly emerging left about the future of Japan. But for all the heated exchanges, the Americans are in charge and giving the instructions. One of the most far-reaching and popular of MacArthur's reforms came in the countryside, where the landlords were seen as a feudal and anti-democratic influence. Nearly half the land was farmed by peasants. They didn't own the fields, they were tied to an old system of paying rent in kind. At harvest, much of their crop had to be given to the landlords, who were often absentee. Peasants were burdened with debt.
The rent we paid was extremely high. It didn't matter how hard we worked, we could never own our own land. And it has been like that for a long time.
Centuries of exploitation were ended by a bold land reform, which affected 6 million families.
農地売り渡し票が小作人代表に渡されました。村の人たちは総出でその日を祝いました。
Tenant farmers could buy their own land at low prices from the government, who gave equally low compensation to the landlord.
I'd become a proper farmer in my own right. I could buy my own farm tools.
But more than that, it was the realization that we were all equal now. Landlord and tenant, we'd all become equal. From now on, the landlords couldn't order us about, telling us to do this and that anymore.
Yes, but around here, there hadn't been landlords really who'd ordered people about like that.
Oh, yes, there had been some.
The drive to root out feudalism and militarism was extended to every part of Japanese society. The Shinto religion was a prime suspect. Its priests were denigrated and separated from the state. Japan's school system, with its high standards of literacy, had been tightly controlled.
And during the wartime, teachers were telling us, and Americans were about to land, and said, take your knife from your kitchen and at least kill one American. And after the war, 180-degree turn. And of course, they had directives from the government and from the occupation forces to teach us democracy.
Deeply rooted in Japanese teaching was the idea of blind obedience. We have insisted upon one change, that the teaching program be free of militarism.
Schools were reorganized on the American model. Textbooks were changed.
And the teachers were telling us which sentence to be, or which phrases to be striking out, and they were writing them down on the blackboards, and we were using Chinese ink and the Japanese brush and striking all these out. Some of the pages looked totally black.
There was an order telling us to destroy school textbooks, particularly the ones that referred to military training and military drill, anything like that. Books of that kind were supposed to be destroyed, burned. But thinking about it now, there were some we did not destroy. We just put them away, locked them away somewhere.
Japanese films and traditional kabuki theatre were scrutinized. The authorities banned some historic plays altogether and censored the rest.
Yes, ritual suicide by disemboweling and cutting people down in sword fights and spilling blood and praying to the gods, all those things were very strictly controlled.
The Americans said we should make films that condemned the old feudal system. Which meant that samurai films were right out, and gangster films were forbidden too. They wanted us to make films showing what terrible things the militarists had done.
During the war, actress Riko Ran had been the Japanese forces' sweetheart. After the defeat, she changed her name and was hired to make a new style film with Mr. Yoshimura.
The day our lives shine was a love story about the daughter of a good family who'd come down in the world. She's in love with a soldier who's fallen into a kind of anarchy after the war. He feels that nothing can be relied on.
Encouraged to copy Hollywood, Japanese directors pioneered another breakthrough.
I remember having to make the actors give each other a long kiss, but neither of them knew when to take their mouths away and end it.
It was the first time in a Japanese film there'd ever been a kiss. And I was terribly embarrassed and I didn't know how to do it at all. So the problem was how long the kiss should go on for. How could we time it? So we talked about it with Yoshimura and he said, well, I don't know either.
I couldn't give them a visual signal because they couldn't see. But we were taking a shot from the chest up, so their legs were out of sight. So when I gave the signal to the assistant director, he scratched the back of her leg. And that was the signal for them to separate.
And everybody who was there was too shy to watch. I mean, the young men who were doing the lights and so on were terribly embarrassed.
Audiences took to it. Japanese culture now had to compete with American imports. It was a time when Reader's Digest became the biggest selling magazine in Japan. Japan's conservative politicians and the business interests who supported them resisted change most fiercely when democratization was extended to the economy, and the Americans took on the huge conglomerates, the Zaibatsu.
The Zaibatsu had become a huge system, and most of the families involved in them had been rich for many generations, and industries had been concentrated in their hands. For example, with the Mitsui family, under the head of the family, there were 11 branches, all related to each other, and that was how they controlled their group.
The reformers on MacArthur's staff thought the Zaibatsu had to go.
We did not think it was possible to achieve political democracy if the economy were controlled by a handful of business families.
明治維新以来74年間、日本の政治経済界を支配していた三井三菱らの大独占財閥は、10月8日、いよいよ解体の第一歩を踏み出しました。財閥解体の章にあたる整理委員会では、
We
were astonished. As we Japanese say, it was like water in the ear of a sleeping person. On the day the announcement was to be made, we collected together at the company offices. Mitsui Hachiroemon, the company president, was going to make a speech. At that time, I was company secretary, and I had to write the speech. I was crying as I wrote it. He said, Mitsui has a 300-year history, but now we have to bring it to an end and break the company up. Everyone was crying.
もう解体されておりないと。その莫大な利益を示す株券は10月8日午前10時、三菱本社で木箱に詰められ、MT や日本警官の物々しい警戒のうちにトラック2台で産業銀行に運ばれました。住友、安田、中島財閥などの株券もやがてはここに運び込まれる運命にあります。
When the Americans planned further breakups and extended the purchase to more businessmen, Yoshida played for time. He disagreed with the American approach and wrote later, "The occupation commenced its work on the erroneous assumption that we were an aggressive people of the militarist tradition, to be refashioned into a peace-loving nation." One of the occupation officials who led the reforms was Justin Williams.
The conservatives just subconsciously and consciously, for that matter, resisted anything that was a change. It had been done this way in Japan for generations, and they would keep it that way because it worked.
You cannot change the personalities or character or tradition or history of one particular country overnight. Within the space of, say, 5 years or 6 years, it's impossible to change. Because traditionally you cultivated you entertained your culture for the period of more than 2,000 years. It's impossible to change that character or mentality entirely.
As a further part of the drive to weaken big business, the Americans strengthened the voice of the workers.
Today, the Japanese have the right to join unions and bargain collectively. At the end of the war, there had been no genuine labor unions in Japan. Now there are 20,000 unions and 5 million union members in Japan.
I'd go around the buildings that were still standing, which had a red flag on top of them, or a factory with a red flag waving from it. What people had done was to take a Japanese national flag with the red sun in the middle and dye the white bit around the outside red as well. I'd go inside and ask them what they were up to, and they'd say, "Oh, we've formed a trade union."
When we heard that we were going to form a trade union, well, to be honest, we were completely ignorant about what they were, and we had to learn about them from scratch.
Mr. Suzuki became one of the leaders.
In my place of work, we founded a trade union. It was the Shinagawa Locomotive Yard Union. I was the first union head. Something to eat, something to wear, a place to live. Those were our three demands, for food, for clothing, and housing. We wanted to be able to live like proper human beings.
Labor relations became the major area of conflict in the first 3 years after the war, between left and right, idealism and harsh economic reality. The new unions grew increasingly militant and political. A rush of strikes hit industry and the public services.
ついにスイッチを切り、世界初めてのスウェーデンストを断行しました。
その他の民主的な勢力だと思います。で、これが大きなこの戦線を作ってですね、法廷に転じました。
The communists took the lead. A movement to raise wages in step with spiraling food prices became a political struggle to overthrow Prime Minister Yoshida and put in a people's government. To Yoshida, communism had always been the real threat.
He always hated communism, like waving a red flag to a bull. He was afraid of communism in Japan because he thought that if the really turned to communism would become thorough communist.
The unions now planned a general strike for February 1947. The Americans grew worried.
The workers' leaders were called into the American headquarters. They were told to give up the idea of a general strike, to solve the problem by negotiation. The Americans told them over and over again. But the strike leaders said, you were the ones who told us to form trade unions.
The Americans didn't want to intervene. They hoped Yoshida would settle on his own. There were more huge demonstrations calling on Yoshida to go. Finally, one day before the strike was due, the Americans acted. They ordered the leader of the strike, Yashiro E, to call it off.
He resisted the order cancelling the strike up to the last. He said that he couldn't call it off on his own authority. He would have to convene a proper meeting and decide the issue democratically. But he was told, no, there's no time for that. And he was coerced into writing a declaration.
The announcer read General MacArthur's ban order. Then E made a special broadcast.
I stayed on in the union office. I was sure somebody would come. And then, at about 11, back came Yashiro E, all by himself, and he came into the office, and he said to me, the bastards have done for us.
It was a turning point. Yoshida had warned the Americans from the start. Now he felt vindicated.
Yoshida himself heaved a great sigh of relief. It was a weight off his mind, a great relief to him. And at the same time, he thought that MacArthur had now understood the problem. Yoshida used to say that. Now he could work for Japan's recovery with that assurance of understanding behind him.
If the general strike had matured, there would have been a people's republic. That was what they were driving at, and we saw that. It would have been the end of what we call pluralism. It would have been one-party rule.
But to other Americans on MacArthur's staff, it seemed like a betrayal. Japanese workers had been encouraged to exercise their rights, and then they'd been denied.
They had been told that there was a right to organize, that there was a right to strike, and they were simply operating within what they had been given, and then at the moment of their power, this was cut off.
After the general strike, the occupation changed direction. The early idealism was put aside. The Cold War was intensifying. China was going communist. In Washington, President Truman's administration criticized MacArthur's reforms for destabilizing Japan. Secret new instructions were sent to Tokyo. Second only to U.S. security interests, economic recovery should be made the primary objective of United States policy in Japan. The unions faced new controls. Strikes by public workers were banned, and leftist leaders lost their jobs.
I was sacked in the first group because I was at that time the person with the central responsibility for the Union of National Railway Workers. And in my personal case, the reason given for my dismissal was that I did not cooperate with the management.
Businessmen celebrated when the drive to break up big companies was called off and the purges ended. The Japanese people grew more conservative too. The only post-war socialist government fell after a corruption scandal. Yoshida and the Conservatives won a sweeping election victory in 1949. In 1950 came the greatest American turnaround. Only 4 years after the peace constitution, John Foster Dulles of the American State Department came to Japan to urge Yoshida to help defend the West and rearm.
Mr. Yoshida said about rearmament, it's a kind of a joke, but he said, a thin horse cannot bear heavy burden. If you put too much burden on him, the horse will fall. And that is a description of how the Japanese economic situation at that time was.
But only days after the Dulles visit, the Korean War broke out. With American troops called across to the fighting, Yoshida could no longer resist rearmament.
The
Japanese went into uniform again, but in deference to the no army clause in the Constitution, they were called the National Police Reserve, later the Self-Defense Force. The Japanese economy revived with huge American orders for munitions and supplies to fight Korean and Chinese communists. And the war was used to justify a new drive against communists in Japan itself. The government closed down the Communist Party paper.
トラック十数台を連ねた武装警官約500名は8月1日午後2時東京代々木の共産党本部を襲いました。
Obeying American instructions, which he welcomed, Yoshida began a series of red purges. 22,000 alleged leftists were sacked from the civil service and industry.
印刷所などを約3時間にわたって捜査しました。私はこの言葉を見たときに、ドイツのヒトラーのやったことを思い出さざるを得ない。ヒトラーが民主主義をぶっ潰して、ファシズム独裁を樹立したときに、まず第一に、ファシズムの徹底的な敵であった共産党をまず第一にやっつけた。今後、どういうふうに、私ですか、それで、登用できますので、哲学家や生涯でもしようかと。生涯だとどういうふうになっちゃうんですか。貿易ね、それから夏抜きですからな、アイスキャリアやるから、どうですか。
じゃあ私なんかもね、逮捕状が出て。
After I was purged, an arrest warrant was issued, so I had to go underground. I couldn't stay in Japan. I had to go back to China.
It was the unions that were under the control of the communists that were causing the trouble, so that Yoshida took advantage of this to dismiss them. It served the purpose of cutting down the number of employees and saving money. It also, of course, and he may have had this more in mind, cutting down the power. Yes, it weakened the leftists, but it was plain by this time they were not interested in the American form of democracy, which was the purpose of the occupation.
What most concerned the Japanese during the occupation was when it would end. At the start, some Americans reckoned it might take 25 years to remake the Japanese mind. But the American vision for Japan had altered. Yoshida's approach merged with their own, and the world had changed quickly.
Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida arrived in San Francisco with his daughter to sign a peace treaty, which the free world has worked to make just and lasting. San
Francisco Peace Conference comes Premier Shigeru Yoshida. Accepting the treaty terms, he pledges that Japan is a new nation dedicated to peace, democracy, and freedom. Japan signs last, and a page in history is turned.
It was a partial peace. The Russians and the Chinese didn't sign. The newly independent Japan was firmly in the American camp. A separate security pact allowed the Americans to keep troops on in Japan in a relationship that would affect Japanese politics for years to come. But the occupation really ended months before the treaty was signed, when General MacArthur was fired by President Truman in a dispute over the Korean War.
Both Japanese and Americans were very shocked. When the day came for him to go home, I stood here to see him off. The big Cadillac came out of the gate here, and there were policemen and crowds lining both sides of the road. Everyone was very sad. We were wondering what would happen now.
I came in a big car, and there we were all lined up in a large circle, and he shook hands and said goodbye to the main people.
I did my duty, went along with him, and identified members of the Supreme Court, members of the Cabinet, members of the Diet. There seems to be genuine grief on the part of the Japanese people.
He had a sense of the human condition and the will of the people, and I always believed in him. He had real qualities of leadership.
There were even Japanese military men who wanted to put up a statue to MacArthur. Things got to the point where some people thought like that. I said it wasn't necessary. Not that it would be worthless, just that it was unnecessary.
The occupation saw a struggle between what the Americans wanted to impose and what different Japanese wanted for themselves. Japan gained new freedoms, but the old elite was still in charge, and many of the reforms were later revised.
Everything MacArthur achieved was done against the background of the fact that he and his side had won, whereas Yoshida's side had lost. He started from rock bottom. But the fact that in spite of that, Yoshida was able to speak so absolutely frankly and hold his end up means he was really twice as great as MacArthur. That's what I think.
At the end of the occupation, Japan was still desperately poor, torn by political arguments. Few foresaw the rise that was to come. But new evidence of Yoshida's own long-term vision has emerged with the discovery of a letter he sent to a friend at the end of the war. At the time he wrote, in August 1945, Tokyo was still smoking in ruins. MacArthur hadn't even landed. Yoshida had opposed militarists. He hoped now they'd be cut out of politics. If this happened, he wrote, we could re-establish the whole empire out of this way of deceit. Science will be developed. Business will be re-established with American capital. And in the end, the empire will exercise its latent capabilities. If so, it is not so bad to be defeated in this war. After the rain, sky and land will become more green.
Drawbacks in Nippon, the learning machine.